Hello and welcome to the Mr. Manley History Teacher podcast. This is the first ever episode of the Mr. Manley History Teacher podcast, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about the history of the hamburger. Now, some of you may have seen some of my previous videos I've created which have mainly focused on GCSE and A-level exam technique and revision, but these podcast episodes are going to be a much more light-hearted, informative, yet hopefully quite fun take on historical events and topics. So that's what you've got to look forward to over the next few weeks and hopefully even next few months too. Now, in the description underneath the video, there's a link to my Twitter page, Mr. Manley History Teacher, and there's a survey on there in terms of asking you what you'd like future episodes to be on. So click on the Twitter link in the description. At the top of my Twitter page, there should be a survey for you where you can click on whatever topic you'd like to hear about in future podcast episodes. So, like I said, go onto the description, click on the Twitter link, click on one of the options on the survey, and I'll plan my future podcast episodes about what it is you want to find out about in these history podcast episodes. Now, like I mentioned already, this first episode is going to be focusing on the history of the hamburger. And there's a little bit of debate, to be honest, in terms of the origins of the hamburger itself, whether or not the Romans created the hamburger or actually whether it was another historical group that founded the hamburger in its earliest forms. So the Romans, apparently in the 1st century AD, so 2,000 years ago pretty much, basically put together some ground mince, some pine nuts, some pepper, and some flavourings of wine to create a burger. Now, that's one theory on where the hamburger comes from, but there is another theory that actually another group of historical individuals, the Mongols, who, as you might have guessed, came from Mongolia. Actually, it was them in the 11th and 12th centuries that founded the burger. And basically, the Mongols, if you haven't heard about them before, they were quite a savage, quite a brutal, warlike tribe of individuals that spread across Europe and Asia, and Central Asia. And essentially, they put their meats underneath their saddles, so between the saddles and the horses, and they stayed on these saddles for such long periods of time, they didn't really have opportunities to stop and build a fire for their meal. So what they did is they put meats, mainly beef, underneath their saddles, and they'd be riding around on their horses, going up and down, and the meat would tenderize underneath the saddles and flatten into patties, and then they would eat these patties actually raw because the meat would become so tender. Although I don't advise you eating any meats, even if it is beef or steak raw, just for health and safety reasons. So don't, by the way, if you're listening to this podcast, decide that steak looks pretty tender, I'm going to eat that raw. Probably not the best idea, so don't do that. So really went quite quiet on the burger front for the next few hundred years until the sort of early modern period, which is from the years about 1500 to about 1750. And it was actually in London that the first term of mincemeat being connected to a hamburger came about, because what was seen in a recipe book in 1747 London was the Hamburg Sausage. And essentially in this recipe book, it describes a mixture of sausage, of ground mince, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, garlic, vinegar, salt, red wine and rum to be served on toast. So not quite like your typical fast food restaurant burger that you get served today, but the early sort of versions of that can be seen potentially in 1747 London. The next time the hamburger is mentioned is actually in the English dictionary in 1802, when in the dictionary it describes a hamburger steak as a hard slab of salted minced beef, often slightly smoked, mixed with onions and breadcrumbs. Now that sounds pretty delicious to me. I'm not sure about you, but that sounds pretty delicious to me. Now, from the mid-19th century onwards, hamburger and the word hamburger starts to appear in different states and different cities in the United States of America. So in Virginia in 1845, in Eric County Fair, New York in 1885. And there are actually lots of Germans moving over to New York in the latter part of the 18th century, and they might have been bringing over with them sausages and meats to create a burger. Other states in America where this term hamburger appears: Wisconsin, Oklahoma in 1891, and Connecticut in 1900. So in the latter part of the 1800s, different parts of America are starting to see this term Hamburg or hamburger starting to appear. Now, the burger really exploded onto the scene in America in the 1920s and the early part of the 1930s. However, it was cut short, really, the popularity of the burgers temporarily during the Second World War, because of the fact that rationing, which meant that you're only allowed a certain amount of different types of food, and meat was rationed in the Second World War, and that meant that burgers' popularity declined or stagnated slightly, so it slowed down a little bit. However, that didn't stop American soldiers during the war taking hamburgers overseas with them, because rationing only really applied to civilians, not for soldiers and people in the Navy and the Air Force. So during the Second World War, there were a couple of brothers that actually, after the Second World War, in the latter part of the 1940s in California, a couple of brothers, I'm not going to call them by their real name because it will give you a bit of make it too obvious, and also due to licensing reasons, I don't want to name these brothers because I might get in trouble. So I'm going to call them the Flip-Flonald brothers. Opened their burger bar in San Bernardino, California, and they started to branch out, open up franchises and other restaurants. And so by the late 1950s, Flip-Flonalds had sold over 100 million burgers. Now, an absolute golden nugget of a statistic here, that the Flip-Flonalds today sell over 75 hamburgers per second, which I think is pretty amazing. Now, if you enjoyed this episode of Mr. Manley History Teacher podcast, click on the like button. You can go onto the description and, like I said already, go onto the Twitter page, vote on what you'd like to appear in a future episode of Mr. Manley History Teacher podcast. And if you haven't subscribed to my page already, Mr. Manley History Teacher, make sure you click the subscribe button after you've finished listening to this video. Thanks so much for listening. Hope you listen to one of my podcasts again soon.